Start then.
Just a minute. Maybe just I'll give a brief introduction about you,
Sure.
and then we will keep going. Good evening, everyone. I'm Saraswati, as most of you know, Secretary General of the Madras Chamber of Commerce, and we are here for our 10th Sustainable Speaks Talk series. We have had quite a number of things on climate financing, water, the ground realities, green hydrogen, answer sites, many topics so far. And as I said, this is 10th in the series. And this is being organized under our Sustainable Chennai Forum, which was started in our 175th year. As you know, Madras Chamber is the oldest chamber in southern India, second oldest in the country, with around 188 years of history now. And this Sustainable Chennai Forum was started in 175th year in 2011, and with the sole objective of making a business case for sustainability, and which stands on our 5 pillars: energy, water, waste management, urban greening, and transport. So we have been having number of activities under this SCF, and Sustainable Chennai is a pilot thing where we want to expand, go along. And one of the things we started a year back is this Sustainable Speak Talk series, where we try to introduce some new concepts and maybe later on take more deeper discussion into that with eminent speakers. And as I said, we have had number of programs all along. So today we are happy to present Dr. Rajnish Kumar, FRSC, who is a professor in the Department of Chemical Engineering at IIT Madras. Prior to that, he had served as a senior scientist at CSIR-NCL and a research associate at National Research Council, Canada. His PhD is from the University of British Columbia, Canada, and has research interests in gas hydrates, carbon dioxide capture, process development, and scaling up. He worked from his research group is well cited. His works from his research group is well cited, and so far they have published more than 100 research articles all along. And we should really congratulate him for being a recent awardee of the prestigious Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize, which is given for outstanding scientists on different streams. And he has got this award for his contribution to engineering science. I think we should really give him a big applause on that. He was recognized also as Highly Cited Researcher in the year 2018. In 2020, Dr. Rajnish received Dr. YBG Verma Award for again his excellence in chemical engineering teaching at IIT Madras. Dr. Rajnish sits in the editorial boards of many journals, including Energy and Fuels, ECS Engineering, EU, and Scientific Reports. I am stopping in the interest of time, and it's indeed a pleasure, sir. We welcome you for this virtual session. I also welcome all the other members, governing council members, invitees, representatives from our member companies, and Mr. Venkatachalam Iyer, our advisor for the Sustainable Chennai Forum, who was the former MD of the Orient Green Power, to join this talk. Thank you so much. Let me just request all of you to put your mobile phones on your videos on and audio on silent mode, so that doesn't interfere in the presentation. I now leave the screen to Mr. Dr. Rajnish Kumar. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Saraswati Madam. And let me first thank you and others in Madras Chamber basically for inviting me and to allow me to deliver this talk. So the talk today, I'm going to talk about carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and sequestration. I'm trying to give a little different perspective and try to give you an idea what exactly is basically holding or what are the challenges you basically find in CO2 capture, utilization, and sequestration. Even if we have been talking about this from last probably more than a decade now, and you will see that not really much has happened on the ground. Not even a single commercial power generation unit or any industry has basically done it at a scale which is required. So let me explain you what are the challenges which one basically faces in this CCUS. But the point which I would like to make ultimately is that this is probably the only solution in short term to mid term for net zero path, which we have committed to reach by 2070. So with this small background, let me give you some more detail over here. So if you see here, the actual CO2 emission has been much above our best predictions. If you look into this particular slide over here, so this deliberately I have put a dated slide, which was 2018. And at that time, it was basically assumed that we have already going to reach peak or we would reach peak by 2020. The reason basically quoted around that time was they were expecting that there will be certainly some CCS or CCUS technologies will come in near future, and the amount of CO2 which is basically going to the atmosphere by anthropogenic activities will reduce. But that was not the case. If you see the data, it seems we are still basically emitting more and more CO2 every year. And now the prediction suggests that we might peak at only by 2030. Now that is something which is certainly challenging. If you look into the data which we currently see, last year, that is 2022 or 23, we basically around the world, we have emitted around 41 gigaton of carbon dioxide, or in other words, it is 41 billion tons of carbon dioxide. So this is the yearly emission of CO2. And the Paris agreements basically talks about 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees rise in average global temperature. So if we look into this and we try to look at how much CO2 we can basically emit before we go to attain this 1.5 degrees or 2 degree rise in global average temperature, is shown in this particular slide. Again, this is the slide which is a very recent data. And you will see here that our global emission in 2020 was 41 billion tons. And likelihood of keeping warming below 1.5 degrees, we have roughly a credit of around 250 billion tons. So what basically it means that if the rate at which we are currently emitting, within 6 years, we will emit enough CO2 that the global average temperature would rise by 1.5 degrees. Now that puts us around 2030 or 2029. And this is when we are about to peak. That is what the current prediction shows. So the data basically suggests that we are going to breach this 1.5 degree target very soon. That would happen around by 2030. Now, 1.5 degree target we are not going to reach. So let's look at what would be the timeline which we will have to basically adhere to reach the global average 2 degrees centigrade. And as per that, we have roughly 1150 billion tons of CO2 credit. It basically means that at this rate, if we are emitting at around 41 billion tons of CO2 every year, we have roughly another 15-20 years before we can basically go to 2 degrees centigrade. So that puts us at around 2050 ballpark figure. So by 2050, if we are able to achieve, if we have to achieve this 2 degrees centigrade target, we have to basically come down, or we have to reduce our CO2 emissions significantly before 2050. So with this background, let me tell you what is the status of India. So this is the global average. The India average, if you see here, I'll show you in this particular slide. In India, we produce 3 billion tons of CO2 every year. This is again a recent data. So roughly 2.9 billion tons or 3 billion tons you can basically talk about. So we produce roughly 3 billion tons of CO2 every year. Before we move on, so that basically brings me to this particular slide. If we have to achieve this target of 2 degrees centigrade by 2050, how much CO2 will have to basically cut down? Either we start cutting it down today, or by 2050, how much CO2 has to be reduced? So if you look into this particular slide, it talks about around 700 billion tons of CO2, which has to be reduced by 2050. And where this 700 billion tons will come from? In power sector, mostly if you look into this slide, we have to basically cut down around 200 billion tons of CO2 by switching to an alternate fuel or renewable. You see here, we talk about this green light. So right now, all the electricity production which in India or primarily anywhere else in the world, which happens through use of coal, has to move from coal to renewables. Now, this is the target, around 200 gigatons of CO2 has to be cut down by 2050. If you talk about industry, again, they will have to improve energy efficiency. That probably will reduce their CO2 emission significantly. They can also do fuel switching, basically going from higher, going from hydrocarbon-based fuel to basically hydrogen, and also CCS, which you basically see over here, carbon capture and sequestration. In power generation sector, you have around a much larger number. In industry, we can do it at much a smaller number. Transportation, obviously in transportation, you cannot do significant CCS because the tailpipe gas which comes out is not very much suitable for carbon capture and sequestration. So there you have to either switch to renewable, or you have to switch to a different fuel, or you will have to either all increase the energy efficiency. Now, when talking about energy efficiency in transportation, let me tell you, in last 30 to 40 years, the energy efficiency in transportation has not increased significantly. What has rather improved is that the road conditions has improved. So the time which used to basically, if you are traveling 100 kilometers 10 years back, it used to take say 3 hours. Today, it might take you 2 hours. So yeah, the time for which you basically drive to reach the same distance has reduced, and that has basically improved the efficiency. But efficiency of the engine itself has not gone up significantly. There is a lot of scope for fuel switching in transportation, and also using renewable fuel. So this is the story of transportation. In buildings as well, I think we'll have to significantly improve the energy efficiency of buildings. Typically, it's the cooling load, which we talk about in this particular case. So the cooling of building has to improve significantly, and that would enhance the energy efficiency. And there are other transformations which again has to basically talk about, which talks about the amount of CO2 which we will be able to basically cut down, either by doing CCS or by increasing the energy efficiency. So if you see here, two major focus comes into picture. One is energy efficiency, which we have been continuously working on around the world. But then the other part is CCS, that is in short to mid-term, if we can somehow capture the CO2 which we are emitting, and then either utilize that captured CO2 or sequester that captured CO2. So that is something which is of prime importance in short to medium term. Nuclear is another option which has been talked about, especially for power generation. But since there is shortage of time, I'll not really talk about nuclear today, but I'll touch upon some other relevant fuels which basically would be able to be utilized instead of fossil fuel. Now, coming back to renewable, I talked about the energy efficiency a bit, about transportation. Let's talk about how much renewable we have been able to use in India. Now, if you look into the renewables percentage in India, if you look at this particular data, this is again a very recent data. We have not fared quite good, actually. We are pretty much at the same ballpark figure, around 20% since 1985. So we have been talking about renewable from last, say, 30 years. But actually, our percentage of renewable in our total energy mix has not increased significantly. We were around 20%, and today also we are still at 20%. So that's something which we'll have to always have a reality check, that it's very easy to talk about moving to renewable, but how much we have been able to do basically is seen in this particular data. Certainly, we have been now focusing a lot on renewable, especially the solar mission is there. So let's look into what is happening in solar. So we had a target of around 500 gigawatt installation by 2030. Are we reaching there? I don't think so. So our installation has improved in last several years, but it has not really picked up the pace at which it should have increased. So I'm pretty sure that by 2030, our target of 500 gigawatt, we are going to miss by a significant margin. So that's also the reality of our installation of solar panels and all. But then the next question, which is I'm going to talk about today, is about carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and sequestration, and how hydrogen is basically connected to the entire story of CCUS. So talk about solar installation, and mostly I assume that since the focus of India has been mostly about solar installations, so let's try to understand what are the challenges in this solar installation. I'll not spend a lot of time here, but what I was trying to say that the sunshine hours typically is around 6 hours every day. So there are only, right now, there are few options which you basically you can use to basically utilize the energy which is coming from the solar panels. One is to convert that electricity into hydrogen, and the other option is to basically store that electricity into batteries. Now, both of these are important, but hydrogen, I would say, is significantly more important, because hydrogen would be required for many other operations in near future. The reason why I'm saying this is because if tomorrow, if you're not going to basically exploit fossil fuel for at all, and fossil fuel not only gives you carbon, it also gives you hydrogen. So all those chemicals which basically rely on hydrogen from the fossil fuels would require hydrogen in future. So if someone tells you that, okay, we will not be utilizing any fossil fuel, either it is coal or it's oil or any other form of fossil fuel, basically it means that we are not only stopping production of carbon from these fossil fuels, we are also stopping production of hydrogen. So if nothing else, you would need significantly large amount of hydrogen, and the hydrogen will especially come from the green hydrogen or electrolysis of water, which basically will be powered by the solar panels. So you'll have to look into how efficient is this particular process. So 55 kilowatt hour of electricity, which you will produce from solar panel, is required to give you 1 kilogram of hydrogen. Now, if you are going to use hydrogen as a fuel, then or as a energy carrier, then you'll have to basically convert this hydrogen back to electricity so that you can basically utilize this electricity for some processes. The best available process right now is using a fuel cell. So if you are going to convert 1 kilogram of hydrogen by using a fuel cell, you are going to get back 30 kilowatt hour of electricity. So if you see here, you are creating 1 kg of hydrogen from the electricity which you get from your solar panel, and you convert back that hydrogen to electricity by the most efficient process today, which is available, that is fuel cell. Is you only get back around 50% of the energy which you have basically used to produce that 1 kilogram of hydrogen. Now, in this, it has been assumed that the fuel cell is sitting just beside the solar panel. If you have to transport this hydrogen to a far-flung places or to a large distance, then you'll have to worry about the storage and transportation cost which comes with hydrogen, and this is not really small. So depending upon how far you are going to transport or how often you need to transport this hydrogen, you are going to consume another 10 to 15 kilowatt hour of electricity just for transporting 1 kilogram of hydrogen. So now you can do this calculation. So 55 kilowatt of electricity which you basically produce from the solar panel, 25 kilowatt you have lost over here, and another 10 to 15 kilowatt you have lost over here. So ultimately, out of 55 kilowatt, you are basically utilizing only 15 kilowatt of electricity which comes out of solar panel. So this is something which people have to always realize, that the conversion of one form of energy to other form of energy also is not very efficient as of today. So maximum what you can get is like 20% of the potentially whatever you basically produce can be converted into any form of usable energy. This is something which one has to always keep in mind. The story of storage of electricity in batteries is also not much better than this, but I don't have time to discuss that aspect today. But what I was trying to tell you, why I discuss hydrogen here, because it connects to the CCS problems, which I'm going to discuss in the next slide. So now coming back to the CCUS problem, you see here, if we talk about carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and sequestration, it's basically a three-step process. Any form of fossil fuel which you use to generate energy, which will be used to produce any material around the world. You talk about brush, which you basically do as soon as you get up, the toothpaste, the brush. And right now, if you go to sleep in your bed, you need the cotton sheets or you need your pillows, everything from the time you get up and the time you basically end your day. All the material which you are synthesizing for your daily need is basically you uses fossil fuel to get produced. So for all this process, you basically rely on some form of process, and any process which has to be done at higher temperature requires you to supply energy. And currently the energy comes from the fossil fuel, which we basically get from under the earth. Now the process what we have been following from last 100 to 200 years is this, that we need energy, we dig under the ground, we get the carbon and the hydrogen from under the ground, we burn this carbon and hydrogen in oxygen or in air, we utilize the energy for all our basic need, and the CO2 which comes out from this combustion process goes back to the atmosphere. We don't collect that CO2 and put it back to earth. So what we have been doing, we have been only utilizing, we are not closing the cycle. You see, we are producing all the carbon from, we are taking it from under the earth, all the CO2 which gets produced goes to the atmosphere. Unless and until we capture the CO2 which is going to the atmosphere and put it back under the earth, the cycle is not closed. So since the operations which we have been doing is an unsustainable operation, we were initially thinking it's not going to affect us, but now it's very much clear that this uninhibited release of CO2 to the atmosphere is affecting us significantly in the form of climate change and global warming. So we need to basically capture this CO2 and put it back under the earth. This is what is a sustainable solution. So if you have to capture CO2 from the point source where basically you are burning the fossil fuel, the CO2 concentration in this particular place is roughly around 10 to 15% of CO2. Why it is 10 to 15%? I'll explain you the reason here. See, when you are trying to produce any energy or any electricity from burning coal, you have to basically burn coal in excess of air. And that basically means that you will not only produce CO2, but you will also produce large amount of nitrogen, which is initially part of the air. You will also produce some oxygen, which has remained unconverted. So the concentration of CO2 which you get from this industry is typically 10 to 15% CO2, and remaining being nitrogen and oxygen and many other poisonous gases, SOx, NOx and all. So currently SOx, NOx are being captured by industry. But since CO2 is not a poisonous gas, there is no policy as such today to not basically emit it. So people would typically emit it. So the first target for CO2 capture is this location where you have around 10 to 15% of CO2. What you will have to do here is that you will have to capture this 10 to 15% CO2, convert that into pure CO2 so that you can either sequester this CO2 under the earth, or you take this 100% CO2, mix it with hydrogen and basically convert into some form of a fuel or any other chemical. I'll come back to that process little later. Now, if you are not capturing your CO2 from point source, what effectively you are doing is that you are releasing the CO2 into the atmosphere, either through the point source or during transportation, use your fossil fuel, which you burn in your cars, that gets emitted as CO2 and all other gases. So this CO2 and this CO2, if you are not capturing anyhow, it will go into the atmosphere. And this is why the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has been gradually increasing. So the other option for you is to capture CO2 directly from the air. Now there is some challenge if you are trying to capture CO2 directly from the air. The CO2 concentration in the point source, if you recall, I talked about 10 to 15% of CO2 and remaining being nitrogen and oxygen. So here for every 10 molecules you are talking about, there is 1 molecule of CO2. Okay, so basically, if I have to capture CO2, I need a material which will capture CO2. I cannot capture CO2 in thin air. So the CO2 capture out of a mixture of CO2 and nitrogen is going to happen in this way. So you need a material which somehow likes CO2. So this material will react with CO2 or interact with CO2, and this material will not interact with nitrogen. So if I am going to pass this CO2 nitrogen mixture through this material, since this material likes CO2, it will capture the CO2 and the nitrogen will just go out from this particular process. So later what I have to do, if I have to produce this CO2, I'll have to regenerate this material. And this regeneration of material is very important, because if you don't regenerate this material, you will not be able to capture fresh CO2. So the process here is about capturing the CO2 and regenerating the material so that you can get the material back and you get pure CO2 in this particular process. Now, in this particular case, you need a material which will be able to identify one CO2 from the other 9 molecules of nitrogen. So doing that is much easier. If I ask you identify one person in a group of 10 person, you can very easily identify that one person. So basically, it's not very difficult for you to identify one person from a group of 10 people. But when we are going to capture CO2 directly from the air, it's a very difficult proposition. In the air, we are talking about concentration of CO2, which is around 420, 430 ppm as of today. ppm basically means parts per million. So what we are trying to say that in the atmosphere, we have one CO2 molecule, and then we have 2,500 other molecules, let it be nitrogen. So in this particular case, we had one CO2 molecules and 10 nitrogen molecule. But in this particular case, when we are trying to capture CO2 directly from air, we have one CO2 molecules and 2,500 other molecules. Now you will realize that identifying one person from a group of 2,500 people is going to be very difficult. So the kind of material which you will utilize to capture CO2 from a point source is going to be very different compared to the kind of material which you are going to utilize to capture CO2 directly from the air. Now, when I talk about kind of material, let me tell you, it's mostly, it lies into the strength of interaction. The material which I'm going to use to capture CO2 from point source might interact with the CO2, but not very strongly. Still, I'll be able to capture this CO2 because it sees only 9 other molecules. But when I'm going to use a material to capture CO2 directly from the air, this material has to be very exotic. This material has to very strongly bind to CO2 because it has to identify one CO2 from 2,500 other molecules. So what is the challenge here? That if I am going to use a material which strongly binds to CO2, it basically means that when I am going to regenerate this material, I will have to give more energy. So it's very much like saying that if I want one molecule A and one molecule B to bind to each other very strongly to produce AB, when I have to basically break it back into A and B, I'll have to give a lot of energy to break this A and B again. Because this is very important for everyone to understand that a CO2 capture process is a two-step process by itself. The first step is the capture of CO2 in the material. And the second step is regenerating the material by releasing that CO2 from that particular material. And both of these process will cost you energy. First, you will have to basically do a process to basically react that material in CO2 so that the CO2 is getting captured. And then once that particular material is captured, you will have to basically heat that material to a temperature much higher than where actually it got captured so that you will be able to regenerate that material. So the process of CO2 capture itself is cost around 25% energy penalty. Now I will explain you what does this mean. This basically mean is that if there is a 500 megawatt power plant, 500 megawatt electricity producing power plant, if I'm producing 500 megawatt of electricity and I am releasing all the CO2 which comes out in the process to the atmosphere, I am getting 500 megawatt of electricity from this power plant. But if I want to capture all the CO2 which comes out from this 500 megawatt power plant so that it does not go into the atmosphere and I somehow capture it in a material, there will be 25% energy penalty just for that particular process from a point source capture. It basically means that a 500 megawatt power plant will become 375 megawatt power plant just for the capture step. Okay, now once you have captured the CO2 from point source, the next step would be to basically utilize the CO2. Either you utilize the CO2 by mixing or reacting this with hydrogen and converting into a fuel, or you basically transport this CO2 to a location where it could be sent back to Earth and it can be captured under the Earth so that this CO2 does not come back into the atmosphere. So if you do that calculation of transportation and sequestration of CO2, that comes out to be another 25% of energy penalty. So what I'm trying to tell you that a process of electricity production from coal, which as of today we are seeing is unsustainable because we are only doing half of the cycle, that is we are producing the energy and we are releasing the CO2 to the atmosphere. If I have to close the loop, that is capture the CO2 and put it back into the earth, we will have to basically give around 50% energy penalty. So that basically means that a 500 megawatt power plant, which currently produces 500 megawatt without capture of CO2 and sequestration of CO2, if I am going to make this particular plant sustainable, this particular plant will only produce 250 megawatt of electricity. In short, what it basically means, today, the cost of production of electricity from Indian coal is around 3.5 rupees per unit. From an imported coal, it could be around 4.5 rupees per unit. So basically, if you are going to produce electricity at 4.5 rupees per unit without capturing and sequestering the CO2, if you are going to capture and sequester the CO2 which comes out from this power plant, it will at least cost you 9 rupees per unit. So basically, if today you are paying 10 rupees per unit for electricity bill, tomorrow, if you are going to make this process sustainable, you will have to pay roughly 20 rupees per unit for the same electricity which you are going to consume. because now the production capacity has reduced by 50%. Now, what are the repercussions? Let me explain you this. The question is, who is going to pay for that? Are we ready to pay, instead of 10 rupees per unit electricity, 20 rupees cost? Now, people may say that, okay, we are not ready to pay. But the next question is that then who is paying for it? Obviously, if you are not paying today, it basically means that we are basically borrowing this money from our future generation, and we are basically in the depth of our future generation. If we do not pay it today, it basically means that we are not basically caring for our future generation. So the question is, if we are not going to pay this 10 rupees extra per unit of electricity, how we are going to make this particular process sustainable? That's the first question we have to basically ask ourselves. This is a big challenge though. And this is probably the prime reason why right now we are not seeing many power plant. I would tell you the data is that around the world, not a single power plant is basically capturing all the CO2 which it is emitting. It's not only India specific data, around the world, not a single power plant is capturing all its CO2 as of today. So we'll have to move in that direction. It's going to cost. But for India, it's even a bigger challenge. I'll tell you the reason why in India it's a bigger challenge. See, today the data shows that in India, 400 million people are not able to afford the cost of electricity which we have as of today. That is a much cheaper rate. So if I am going to increase the cost to 20 rupees per unit, now you tell me how many people will be able to afford it. Since at this rate, if 400 million people are not able to afford it, and they are not able to utilize the electricity because of that affordability issue, if I am going to make it double the cost, this problem will become probably 5 times more. So instead of 400 million people, you will have to just multiply it 5 times of that. So that many people will not be able to afford electricity. Or in a sense, I will tell you that most of our population will not be able to basically afford the cost of electricity. And this is one of the prime reason why this capture process is not going forward anywhere. As far as technology is concerned, let me tell you what are the challenges here. The cost of CO2 capture from point source comes out to be roughly 30 to 50 US dollar per ton. Now, how much is, if you recall, how much we are emitting today? We are emitting 2.8 billion tons of CO2 per year. So the cost of CO2 capture for 2.8 billion tons CO2 per year times 30 to 50 US dollar per ton, you can imagine the kind of money which we are talking about, the kind of investment which has to go in this kind of processes. So this is something which one has to understand. Now, capturing CO2 directly from the air is even an expensive proposition. As I was telling you, that the material which is going to capture this CO2 directly from air, this air is going to be even more exotic compared to the material which is going to capture CO2 from point source. As of today, let me tell you, the cost of CO2 capture directly from air is 200 to 250 US dollar per ton. This is the best process or the optimistic price. Actually, some of the more sustainable process is even more expensive. So this is a story of CO2 capture. Either you capture it from point source or you are going to capture it directly from there. The cost of CO2 capture is prohibitively high. And this is one of the prime reasons why CO2 capture is not really moving forward. Now, let me give you another challenge. This is the challenge on sustainability part. See, the problem here, if you are talking about a material which is going to capture CO2 from point source, let's say I need 1 kilogram of this material to capture 1 kilogram of CO2, which I will regenerate. So if I have to capture 2.8 billion tons of CO2, it basically means that I will have to create that much material to basically capture 2.8 billion tons of CO2. In this particular case, directly from air, I will give you, this is the data directly from air. You see, one of the best material which you will find in literature, which is called metal organic framework, the data shows that it is roughly 0.1 to 1 gram of CO2 per gram of this particular material. So what basically means that if I have to capture 2.9 billion tons of CO2, I may need 2.9 billion kilogram of this material, and I'll have to regenerate it 100 to 1000 times. Now, this is one of the largest challenge one has to basically face when we are talking about from a technology point of view. See, we need a material which has to be regenerated 100 times or 1000 times, and still we need this material which can be produced at a scale of billion kilogram. today metal organic framework, the status of current technology as of today is that we struggle to produce even 1 kilogram of metal organic framework in one month. So this is the challenge. Technologically, we have to basically focus on two things. One, we need the biggest focus has to be, we need a material which is very robust, can be recycled 100 to 1000 times. We don't need a material which has very high strong capacity. I have seen many a times in academic gathering or even with industry, you will be asked a question, oh, how much CO2 your material can absorb? In my opinion, that does not matter. Even if you bring it to one, instead of 1 gram, you go to 2 gram or 3 gram, which is actually right now, there is no such material which exists. But even if you go there, you will still have to regenerate it 100 times, 50 times minimum. So the point I'm trying to make here is that it does not really matter how much is the capacity of that material. What matters, how robust is this material? Whether I am able to regenerate this material 100 times or 1000 times or not. So that should be the focus. That should be the focus on the technology front. Now people will talk about, no, metal organic framework is very academic in nature. There is already a solution. Amine-based solvents are being used from last 50 years, 60 years. We have a lot of people would tell you that we have a lot of pilot scale processes which is working. Even commercial processes are working where natural gas production is being done. Many natural gas plant you will hear is that have a lot of CO2 in there. 50 to 60% CO2 comes out from many natural gas production units. There they are basically capturing CO2 from methane, and then they are basically transporting that methane as CNG, LNG, whatever you call it. All of these processes which uses a very robust process, which is basically amine-based process. Now, let me tell you what is the challenge with an amine-based process when we talk about the scale at which we are talking about. See, the amines, typically the amines are either monoethanol amine, which also is called an MEA, or it's a derivative of monoethanol amine, or similar chemicals basically, which is again some functions of amine will be there. So the question is this: right now you have a coal which you are burning in air, you are producing energy, and then you're also producing carbon dioxide and nitrogen along with this energy. Now this carbon dioxide has to react with this monoethanol amine to basically capture this CO2. The first question one should ask, where monoethanol amine comes from? It does not come from thin air. You will have to produce this monoethanol amine in some process industry, and monoethanol amine is produced from reacting ammonia and ethylene oxide. Now, as of today, the cost $30 to $50 per ton is by using a monoethanol amine which has been produced by an ammonia, which is actually a black ammonia or gray ammonia, whatever you call it. Why I'm calling it black or gray? Because the hydrogen used to produce this ammonia is not green hydrogen. The hydrogen used to produce this ammonia currently is either gray hydrogen or black hydrogen, whatever you call it. The ethylene oxide, which is the other raw material to produce monoethanol amine, actually is a byproduct of fossil fuel production. So now the question is, if I am going to use green monoethanol amine, I need green ammonia and I need green ethylene oxide. Now, if I'm not producing fossil fuel, then where I am going to produce ethylene oxide from? So ethylene oxide will be produced from biomass. Now the question is that, do we really have so much of biomass that we will produce ethylene oxide from biomass? The next question is that if current cost of this monoethanol amine is so much by using gray or black ammonia, now if I have to produce ammonia through green hydrogen route, what would be the cost of monoethanol amine we are talking about? So if the $30 to $50 per ton cost, which is coming out as of today, people might be expecting that this cost will come down by scale up and all. And let me tell you, this cost is not going to come down. It will in fact go up, because as we proceed from today, there will be a pressure on you to produce more green ammonia. There will be pressure on you to produce green ethylene oxide. So the question here is, if I am going to produce monoethanol amine by utilizing these two chemicals, which is also producing CO2, so the first question I will have to ask, how much CO2 I am producing while I'm producing this chemical? Whether this chemical which I have produced, whether is able to capture the CO2 which comes out from ammonia production, and as well as able to capture ethylene oxide which comes out from the ethylene oxide production. So if the first question I should ask, the chemical which I have basically produced to capture CO2 from this power plant, whether this chemical has captured the CO2 which was produced in production of this chemical itself. This is a big challenge in this particular slide. See, the metal organic framework which we talk about is a very complex molecule, very exotic molecule. It's not a single step process. If you are going to produce metal organic framework, it's at least 3-step process. And let me tell you, whatever I have known little bit, every step of any process, if you are going to produce 1 kilogram, it's a thumb rule I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a very accurate number, but still, in thumb rule number is that if you are going to produce 1 kilogram of a material like steel or something, you will produce 3 kilogram of CO2. So the question is that if I'm going to have a 3-step process for production of metal organic framework, for every kilogram of MOF I am going to produce, I am going to produce 10 kilogram of CO2. So the problem here is, if my metal organic framework is going to capture 1 gram of CO2 per gram of MOF, then at least this MOF should be able to recycle 10 times, so that at least I will capture the CO2 which is being produced while I'm producing the MOF itself. It's only beyond 10 cycle that this MOF is going to capture the CO2 which is coming out from power plant. And the same story goes over here. If I am going to produce ammonia, which will also produce 3 kilogram of CO2 in the production of ammonia, if I'm going to produce ethylene oxide, that itself will produce 3 kilogram of CO2 while I'm producing ethylene oxide. So this monoethanol amine should first capture 6 kilogram of CO2 which is coming from this process. Then only this will capture the CO2 which is coming out from the power generation and all. So this is something which people have to worry about. This is the sustainability aspect of it. I will tell you the regeneration losses, which basically is from the experimental data and from all the pilot plants which I have been able to come across in recent past. See, there are 2 kilogram loss of amine per ton of CO2 captured. This loss you cannot basically gain. After regeneration and all, every ton of CO2 while you're capturing, you lose 2 kilogram of amine. So what basically it means is that if I am going to capture 3 billion tons of CO2, I am going to lose 6 billion kilogram of amine as a waste MEA. This MEA cannot be utilized at all. So basically it means I'll have to produce 6 billion kilogram of monoethanol amine every year, which will go and has to be put in landfills, because this cannot be regenerated. All other material can be regenerated, but this 6 billion kilogram of MEA cannot be regenerated. Now the question is that whether this is a sustainable path. That is, I am leaving it to you. So what I'm trying to tell you over here is that if we are going to generate a material to capture CO2, we are always going to worry about how much CO2 was produced while I produce this material. So one other alternate option could be that instead of preparing a new material to capture the CO2, what I can do rather is basically use existing material. And in that particular sense, you can basically use water or seawater or any clay or sand or silica, some of these material which already exist in the on earth or under the earth, which I can basically use to capture CO2. That would be the most sustainable solution. Now, I will try to quickly end the slide because I've been talking for more than 40 minutes now. I'll try to basically give you some more data. This is the largest direct air capture unit which you see here. This is in Iceland. This is the largest direct air capture unit as of today. It's a huge unit. And I will tell you, this captures 4,000 tons of CO2 every year. But you know what? This is equivalent to 1 second worth of global CO2 emission. So what I'm trying to point out over here is that such a large unit, which is capturing 4,000 tons of CO2 every year, is equivalent to only 1 second worth of global CO2 emission. Now I'm going to show you another slide, and this is direct air capture unit. So the CO2 captured directly from the air. I'm not bringing the cost now. I'm sure you know what is the cost at which we have to capture this CO2. So typically it's around $300 per ton. So you can imagine 4,000 tons, if it's capturing every year, how much we are spending in capturing 4,000 tons of CO2, which is only worth 1 second of total global CO2 emission. Now in this particular slide, I am showing you a plant which is going to capture, is actually currently capturing 160,000 tons of CO2 per year. And that converts the CO2 into fuel. So much of CO2 is being converted into fuel. Now, if you look into this, this is 2 minutes worth of overall CO2 emission, 2 minutes worth of, and this is the plant which is there in China. So what I'm going to point it out that please understand the scale at which this problem exists. The CO2 problem is at it's a monstrous scale, and most of the challenge comes because of the scale. It's not that technology is not there, but the scale at which this challenge exists, we don't really know how to basically handle it at this particular scale. Now, in next 2 to 3 minutes, I am going to basically show you a process which we have been working in our lab along with some other processes, where we basically use just water. So this is a reactor where this is a bed which is filled with water. You see these are multiple beds over here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. What we do, we basically pass a mixture of CO2 and nitrogen from this reactor, which basically comes in contact with this water bed. And then ultimately this gas comes out from this nozzle over here. So when the gas enters, it's a gas mixture. And by the time the gas comes out, it's relatively pure gas. It's not pure gas 100%, but roughly 90% pure gas. So here, if I'm entering CO2 and nitrogen, CO2 will get captured in this process. And then what we will get out is roughly pure nitrogen, 95% nitrogen and remaining being gas. And the water which basically captures the CO2 looks like this. These are CO2 hydrates. And this happens at a lower temperature and higher pressure. So we have to basically optimize this process in such a way that the cost of CO2 capture and the regeneration cost is worked out in such a way that this becomes an economic process, and we are able to basically capture per ton of CO2 at the cost of $50 per ton. So this is something which we have been able to basically showcase at a lab scale, at a pilot scale. We have been doing a lot of work on the conventional chemicals which has been going around, like monoethanolamine or a mixture of monoethanolamine with certain other chemicals. So we do a lot of work in our group at molecular scale to understand how a molecule is going to capture CO2, what kind of functional group I need so that it can capture CO2 better, or this molecule will not get deactivated by the presence of SOx or NOx in the gas mixture. So all those we basically study at a molecular scale. Then we scale it up to work in the lab to basically see what are the challenges we are going to face while I'm going to scale it up. And then ultimately we test some of these processes which has been tested at lab scale and has been optimized at a much larger scale in a pilot scale facility, so that at some point of time we should be able to basically scale up. So this pilot scale facility right now exists in IIT Madras in a container. This is a container where you can basically come and have a look at how a CO2 nitrogen mixture or flue gas mixture with roughly 10 to 15% CO2 goes in one of these reactors. And when it comes out from the other end, it's almost 100% CO2. We have also done a lot of work on direct air capture. So this is one process which we have recently delivered to L&T. This is again a TRL 8 to 9 level project where we are basically capturing CO2 directly from the air. So you see here, this side, there is a room. This is a room you see over here, which has got connected to multiple monitoring devices where we monitor the CO2 concentration, the moisture and all other things. So the room from basically picks the air from this and flows this through this blower, goes at the bottom of the reactor. And by the time it comes out of the reactor, this stream is pretty much free of CO2. So we have basically demonstrated it, and L&T is going to implement hundreds of these kind of reactors at different locations to basically demonstrate that CO2 capture capacity directly from the air. But as I was telling you, the process is there, but it is going to cost you. The questions one should ask, who is going to pay for the cost of CO2 capture? Now, the next thing which we have done in our lab, again, we have delivered a pilot scale demonstration here, is that once you have captured so much of CO2, see 3 billion tons of CO2 is not a small amount, and you cannot utilize all this CO2. So if you will have to ultimately rely on sequestering this CO2 under the seabed or under the earth. So we have another process where we have basically demonstrated again at pilot scale how this CO2 could be basically sequestered under the seabed. So this is something which we have been doing in the group. I see I have pretty much taken up my entire time. I will stop over here and then I'll wait for you to ask few questions which you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rajnish. I think I will now, it's a bit scary, it's a bit technical, it's It's really mind-boggling. I would request Mr. Venkachalam Iyer to maybe read out the questions and just lead the Q&A thing. I saw some questions in the thing. Then we can also open the floor for more questions if you want.
Yeah, in fact, a wonderful presentation. Of course, I'll come to that a little later. There was one question from Mr. Alagiri Govind Swami. He's saying one fundamental question is whether to break the CO2 into C and O2 and deposit the solid, deposit it underground. Is that possible? I mean, from energy requirement and cost point of view, obviously, that's what.
Sir, I'll tell you, breaking CO2. See, I'll tell you the question is that what we are starting with. We are starting with carbon, and then we are basically mixing it with oxygen, and we get some energy which we are utilizing, and the CO2 gets produced. So if I am doing this, so let me basically try to explain you this over here. In this particular slide, I might be able to explain you slightly better. You see here, what we are doing, this coal is basically carbon, and this air is basically 20% oxygen. So what I'm doing is that we are reacting C plus oxygen, and we are producing CO2, and in the process, we are producing energy. Now you want me to do the reverse path. So if I'm going to do the reverse path, I would need more energy, no? Whatever I have produced here, I would need an additional energy to reverse this path. The thermodynamics tells you that if I am going to produce so much of energy and produce CO2, the same thermodynamic tells you that if I have to go and reverse this particular path, I need additional energy. And let me tell you the amount of energy which you will have to basically do this. See, this was much easier. It was a solid carbon. So it's very easy for you to basically, the density of the fuel is much higher. Very easy for you to basically react a solid carbon with some amount of air and produce this CO2 and energy. But now if you have to basically do the reverse reaction, this is now a gas. First, you'll have to capture the gas. And then once you have captured the gas, then you can supply energy, this energy and plus some extra energy so that you can reverse this path. So this becomes a challenge. So what you are saying is technically possible, but then you have to always remember that we have to do it at in a process which is net energy generation process, not net energy loss. So this is where the challenge is. This also is basically explained in this particular process. So here we are basically getting electricity from solar energy, but when you are converting it back into hydrogen and getting back the same electricity, you see 25 kilowatt electricity is lost. So this is something which you'll have to always realize. So technically, in short, I'm giving you this answer that certainly CO2 can be split into CO and oxygen, but the amount of energy which you are going to basically consume will be much larger than the amount of energy which you initially got while you burned the coal and produced this CO2. I hope I have answered your question now.
Yeah, Ms. Smita Mishra is asking whether is there a challenge in keeping the sequestration location close to the capture location? Are there any specific requirements for the sequestration location?
See, I'll tell you what happens. CO2 sequestration under the earth or under the seabed, there are certain advantages and certain disadvantages of different locations. If you are going to sequester CO2 under the earth, at the site where you're producing CO2, there are not many options available as of today. You will have to sequester CO2 either in aquifer. Now the aquifer would be pretty much everywhere, but the problem is that the aquifer right underneath your power plant or where you are basically generating the CO2 could be a freshwater aquifer. The freshwater aquifer we need for our sustenance. So if we are going to put CO2 in this freshwater aquifer, we don't really basically anyone would allow you to do that. So you will have to basically put CO2 back into saline aquifers, and the saline aquifers, there are plenty of those aquifers under the seabed, which is not accessible to you, and there might not be a lot of objection for you to basically put CO2 under the saline aquifers, which is existing under the seabed. So in short, putting CO2 under the location where producing CO2 is possible, but I doubt anyone would allow you to basically do that. So this is why people always talk about aquifers, which is under the seabed, which is not accessible to humans, and they may not question you why you are utilizing my freshwater resource and putting CO2 and contaminating that water as well. Smita, I hope I have answered your question now.
So would that actually pollute make any environmental disturbance if we put it far below the seabed? Okay, apart from the cost aspect of it.
See, I'll tell you, if you are going to convert CO2 into a solid, it will not have adverse effect. But if you are going to leave CO2 into liquid or as in gaseous phase, it is certainly going to create some adverse effect. But CO2 sequestration, you see, I'm not using a word storage, which many people use. It's not CO2 storage. We are talking about CO2 sequestration. When we say sequestration, we mean inherently that CO2 has been converted from gaseous phase to a solid phase, which will not go back to the atmosphere. And when you're converting a gaseous solid into a solid phase CO2, either in the form of minerals or some other form, as I was talking about hydrates recently, if you can basically convert it into solid, you are not basically affecting anything, and it will be a much more sustainable approach. It will not create any tsunamis or any volcanic eruption or any earthquakes. Nothing of that kind would happen. At least has not been proven so far.
Yeah. So what about the role of afforestation? There's a question from Ms. Jeba Rupavati.
It looks nice, afforestation, but I was telling you, if you are not utilizing the fossil fuel, there will be huge demand of biomass. So you keep growing all the biomass. This is the only land we have. Where you will grow your biomass will be the question actually. And let me tell you very clearly, photochemical process is not very energy efficient. Neither you can, the efficiency is hardly 5%. So in nature also, it's not done very efficiently. The efficiency is mostly 5%. Even in the lab, if you do photochemical process, the efficiency does not go beyond 6-7%. So I think it's more about the amount of energy which we consume as of today is a bigger challenge, not about whether we can do it through afforestation or not. Obviously, afforestation will certainly help, but do we really have that much of land to basically see? I'll tell you, people do not realize one thing. All the CO2 capture processes which we talk about, which will be either implemented today or in next 20-30 years, cannot stop working. It has to work well beyond 2100. So how many forests you are going to plant? Do you really have so much of a space? You will run out of a space in 5 years, 10 years. We need a technology which will keep running for 2100, 2150 if we have to survive that long. So people don't realize. They say, okay, we'll afforest it. Okay, fine. You can put a lot of forest. But how many years? 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? You will run out of a space after that. Then where you will plant your trees? So the amount of energy which we consume today and the CO2 which we emit today, I don't think we can plant enough tree to basically capture all the CO2. So that is something which everyone has to remember.
Okay, the next question is about is there a limit to sequestration, or does the Earth allow as much sequestration as we would like to do?
There is no limit. If I am going to produce tons of carbon which I have produced from under the earth, I am sure we should be able to put back the similar amount of CO2 back to earth. The problem is that it is going to cost you, and the question again is that who is ready to pay for that cost?
And the next one is from Mr. Shankar. He's asking about when we are looking at switching to a renewable energy, would we really require carbon sequestration? In fact, in that regard, I had one more question. You were talking about we are still about 20% of renewable energy in the grid. And it was the same. In fact, you had shown a higher percentage at an earlier date of about 15-20 years ago in the graph. Is that, I mean, that somehow doesn't, I would like to.
No, I get the question. See, I'll tell you, this is the past data, and I think now the efforts, especially under this current government, has improved significantly. And we are installing large amount of solar panels as of today. But let me tell you what has been the challenge with solar panels. See, 30 years back when solar panels were being produced, it was mostly 90% of the solar panels were being produced from renewable energy. Today, the solar panels, since the demand has gone up, 99% of the solar panels are being produced from gray energy or coal or whatever. So one has to also worry about the CO2 emissions which is being done during the production of solar panel itself. All the calculations which we see as of today basically assumes that the solar panels has been produced from renewable energy, but there is no renewable energy today. All the solar panels which are coming from China, 99.5% of the entire solar panels comes from being produced from burning fossil fuel. And I'll tell you what happens, how the solar panels is being produced. The silica which goes in solar panel are electronic grade silica. You will have to sift tons of material to produce gram of silica. And the process is done twice. Once you have to produce metallurgical grade silica at around 2000 degrees centigrade. and then again you'll have to remelt that entire silica again at 2000 degrees centigrade to produce electronic grade silica. See, the process is very an energy intensive process, and huge amount of CO2 also gets emitted there. So it's not that the solar panel has no CO2 footprint. One has to do a proper life cycle analysis to understand what is the CO2 footprint of a solar panel. Obviously, a solar panel will always be a much greener process because you are going to produce free energy from sunlight for next 20-25 years. But then it's not true that it has zero CO2 footprint. And then the second question comes, and this is what I'm showing in this particular slide. If I'm going to produce 55 kilowatt of electricity by utilizing a solar panel, and ultimately if I'm only utilizing 15 kilowatt of the entire electricity which I have produced, you can imagine what is the efficiency of this kind of renewable energy. So please understand that there is no short-term solution. Even if you are going to go to renewable energy, CCUS has to be adopted. You cannot change completely to renewable energy next day. It will take you at least next 50 years to convert into renewable energy. Today, not a single gram of steel is being produced from green energy. Not a single gram of cement is being produced from green energy. So can you really do it next day? It will take you 50 years. And for next 50 years, if you are going to emit CO2, this is what you are going to see. We are going to see this 2-degree rise of temperature very soon. It will happen by 2050. So these are the challenge. One has to always accept it.
Good. In fact, nobody takes care of the embedded carbon in manufacturing or even in buildings. I think we only look at the future.
No, sir, not only building and manufacturing. I'll tell you the number of clothes we wear today. See, I'll tell you 20 years back when I was a small boy, I used to have 2-3 pairs of clothes. Today, I have at least 25 of them in my closet. Do I really use them? I don't. But I have produced that many number of clothes, and that has already contributed to the CO2 footprint. So this is what I am saying. I think the biggest challenge would be to change the behavior of human. Means as Mahatma Gandhi has said that there is sufficient for our need, but not for our greed. I think we have become too greedy. So if we have become this greedy, this is what we will ultimately lead to. The greed always will lead to this kind of challenges, which we'll have to worry about how we will fix it. But our behavior has changed significantly. Now you will talk about every person has 50 pairs of clothes sitting in there and 10 pairs of shoes. Each of these material, when we synthesize, has a significant CO2 footprint. Are we ready to change ourselves? If we are not ready to change ourselves, how we are going to fix this? I don't think it can get fixed without changing ourselves.
The next question is from Sundarajan. He's talking about when MOF is regenerated, I assume that carbon dioxide will be liberated. Where is it rooted, or the whole MOF with CO2 is buried underground? I think you've answered
No. You cannot bury MOF. MOF is very expensive material. See, what is the process? I'll tell you what is the challenge here. The challenge, again, I'll repeat because this is very fundamental. See, the challenge here is that I produce CO2 which is very lean. I have 10%, 15% from point source, or I have around 400, 500 ppm from direct from the air. See, if I'm going to utilize this CO2, I'll have to mix it with hydrogen. So the current process, which is basically the technology is currently whatever we have, I'll tell you. If I'm using 100% CO2 and thermochemically converting into a fuel, the efficiency of this process is only 20%. Now, let me tell you, if you are using only 10% CO2 and remaining nitrogen, and if you are going to convert this mixture into a chemical, the efficiency is hardly 2%, 3%. So the question is, if I am having 100% CO2 and converting into a chemical is only 20% efficient, then the question is that how can I do the same process with 10% CO2? So you will have the process of metal organic framework or monoethanolamine is necessary because we are going to convert a 10% CO2 stream into a 100% CO2 stream. And for that, we need this material. So what we have done, the metal organic framework will be regenerated, but when you are regenerating this material, you are getting 100% CO2. So now that CO2 can basically go into this particular process and you can mix it with hydrogen, react it with hydrogen and convert it into a fuel. This is why you basically, I hope I am able to answer the question which you have asked.
Correct. The next questions are on viability of the CO2, the sequestration itself. And if there's any numbers in terms of the L&T facility, what is the kind of price per CO2 capture?
No, I have already given the price of CO2 capture in this particular slide, and I am going to stick with these numbers. I will not give you any specific numbers.
Okay.
But this is the number. The cost is here. As far as viability is concerned, as I was telling you, if you are going to make a process sustainable, it is going to cost you. You cannot make a process sustainable and say that I will pay less. That's not going to happen. Neither not happening today and not happening in next 5-10 years as well. So the question is that rather than asking the viability of this entire process, we'll have to ask who is going to pay for it. And this is why I always keep saying that I think we are asking the wrong question. See, we have got used to paying too less. Now the problem is that if we have got used to paying too less, if someone will ask you to pay more, you feel bad about it. 3 years back, we were paying 100 rupees, 150 rupees for a gas cylinder, which we use for cooking. Today, we are paying 1000 rupees and 1200 rupees for a gas cylinder. And who is complaining? No one is complaining. So the question I'm trying to tell you is that you will have to accept it. You will not accept it today. 10 years down the line, you'll have to accept it. But this is the only way up forward. If you keep cribbing about the cost of these processes, then it's not going to happen.
So apart from the seabed, are there any redundant oil wells or mine in India for carbon sequestration?
India, we do not have been blessed with too many oil wells actually. And this is why I think we'll have to look for out of the box solution for sequestering our CO2. And this is why I talked about this seabed. But as I was telling, there are many other options like saline aquifers and all, and a lot of work is going on in my group and in other groups in this country. And there are many opportunities. You can do it in basalt rocks. You can do it in saline aquifers. So there are many other options. And I will tell you, there is no dearth of CO2 sequestration site. We have plenty of that in India.
Yeah, just last two questions. One is the internal carbon pricing value used by corporates towards accelerating green or clean technology. Of course.
Yeah, this is a very valid question. And I think many countries have done it. And I'm pretty sure India is also moving towards it. There has not been much done in so far, but as we speak, there are some policies which are coming up. And it seems within a year or so, we will have some similar policies, which will basically ease some of the burden from industry and will allow them to basically do some CO2 sequestration or CO2 capture and sequestration or CO2 capture and utilization.
Carbon border adjustment mechanism will force us to cost every aspect of our footprint.
Yes, these are all going to happen since nothing is there right now. No good policy there. This is why I don't want to talk about it. But I agree that this is something which is going to help industry to move in that direction.
And the last question is, why do we say that carbon dioxide is generated from under the earth? Don't we produce most of the carbon dioxide on the earth and not under?
No, I'm not saying under the earth. I'm saying that we are getting all the carbon from under the earth. We are burning that carbon. And then when we burn that carbon to produce energy, we also produce CO2 because burning of carbon happens in air or oxygen. So when you are getting, so our requirement is not CO2, that's a byproduct. Our requirement is the energy, but the only challenge is that along with the energy, CO2 also gets produced. So this is why I said that all the CO2 which you see in the atmosphere has come from under the earth, because if you do not produce that carbon from under the earth, that CO2 which you see in the atmosphere, that is at least the anthropogenic CO2 which you see in the atmosphere would not have been there. So I'm not saying that CO2 is coming from under the earth. I'm saying carbon is coming from under the earth. And once we burn it to produce energy, we produce CO2 and we release it to the atmosphere. So in a sense, all the CO2 which you see in the atmosphere, anthropogenic CO2 which you see in the atmosphere is coming from under the earth. So the only option for you is to capture the CO2 and put it back under the earth. Otherwise, it will not be a complete cycle. And if you are not doing a complete cycle, you're not talking about a sustainable process.
Good, sir. I think we've covered most of the questions. And
anyone wants to just raise a quick question?
Any question, if you have any more question, I am available on my email ID, rajnish@iitm.ac.in. You can drop me an email and I'll try to help you out with the answer, whatever to the best of my knowledge. And I also claim that I am not one person who knows everything. I may not be knowing many things. So you can please correct me if whatever I have said is not correct.
Just one last question, I think, again from Smita. What happens to the captured carbon over a period of time?
Captured carbon in this particular process remains like captured carbon dioxide remains like captured carbon dioxide. That nothing happens to it, at least the process which I talked about. But in saline aquifers or in other processes, this CO2 basically gets mineralized and a CO2 will get converted into some form of a salt of carbon dioxide. So for example, if you react calcium oxide and CO2, it will form calcium carbonate, and a CO2 which was in gaseous phase, once it reacts with calcium oxide, will become a solid phase calcium carbonate. So if your sequestration mechanism is mineralization of CO2, it will go back as solid calcium carbonate, which will not come back to Earth.
Okay. So if no further questions, I would request Mr. Venkat to just say a few words of thanks. Before that, on my behalf and behalf of the chamber as well, a big thanks to Dr. Rajnish Kumar for sparing your time and giving such a wonderful thing. And even for a layperson like me, I mean, it at least gives me a broad picture. Thank you. Over to you, Venkat.
Yeah, in fact, for the last few weeks, I was actually ever since I read the Hindu about the wonderful Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Award, and really congratulations to you, sir, for this award. And I'm sure
Thank
many
you, sir.
will
Thank
come. I mean, I was after my friend Mr. M. Subramaniam of GDC, IIT Madras. I said, okay, I must get this Dr. Rajnish to talk to us about carbon sequestration, because the word itself, sequestration itself, sounded very big. And then I read another word in one of your these things, that clatheration. I mean, I said, okay, that's something which you didn't mention the word, but I think it's how to
Yeah, it was,
capture
since the
molecule to
audience
molecule.
is little generic or general, I didn't want it to be too technical. Otherwise, it would get boring for all of you.
No, sir. In fact, the way you explained it, I mean, in very layman terms, for all of us to understand, with numbers, with cost factors into it, I mean, we have really gained a lot. Only thing sometimes we feel, okay, the scope of all these things is really, with all this, it will not take us not just 2050, 2070, probably a far more. Even the last presentation we had on green hydrogen from Sundararajan, he also talked about how it is going to be very difficult to achieve those numbers in terms of $1 per kg.
$1, yeah, is a very difficult target.
Very ambitious target. But one thing we really appreciate and admire, that you're not looking at a chemical process like MEA, you're looking at a physical process of just capturing the carbon dioxide within the seawater, within the water itself. And I think this is going to take us a long way. I mean, your pilot projects are already on, and I'm sure with your expertise, it will really take us a long way. In fact, one question was about whether you can share this presentation. That was one of the questions which...
I will certainly, this is a very, I think the file is a huge 60 megabyte file, but I'll try to convert it into a smaller file of around more manageable size, and I'll pass it on, no problem at all.
Good. Thank you so much, sir. In fact, really appreciate your time and
thank you very much. Actually, if I would have come physically and met all of you, it would have been really nice. I hope I'll be able to meet you all physically, and then I'll give you a similar presentation on some other topic.
Extremely happy to hear that. We will soon organize that, and you can pass on the presentation to us so that we could share it. And just before closing, Mr. Raghuttama Rao, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Good. I'm just listening to Rajnish quite.
But I saw your comment. We can pack up. So I just want to know from you whether we should really do that.
I was not knowing Raghu is also here.
No. I think we work quite closely, and so I was.
I saw your comment, so I thought I should ask you the final word, whether we should pack up.
One quick question, Rajnish. I would have asked you anyway otherwise, but let me ask it in the general interest. So technically, it looks like we can do this. It's just that the economics is a little far out. Does it mean that the economics will tend to get better with technology over the next 10, 15 years?
We will have to basically start somewhere, Raghu. I am not answering your question directly, but I always say that we are already too late. If we keep worrying about the cost of it, we will not be able to reach there ever. So see, technology and everything basically evolve with time. Low cost technologies will come once you start utilizing it. So the question is that we'll have to start doing something. Unfortunately, what is happening in last 10 years, I'm pretty sure many of you would be worried about it, that we have been talking too much about CCUS, but nothing is really peaking. And one of the reasons is that we are probably too much dependent on the cost of it. we will have to slowly go there. Today, we have to implement a strategy like what was done for the vehicular emission, BS1, BS2, BS3, BS. Today, we are BS6. We have reached there, means we have reduced our emissions from poisonous emissions from vehicle transportation and all significantly.
Right.
Day one, it seemed very much impossible, but today we have reached there. So this is what we'll have to basically do this as well. We will have to implement some policy of cutting down our CO2 emission by any industry by 10% in next few years, and then 20% in next further 10 years down the line. One has to start working on it, and the price of the technologies will become a bit more reasonable. But yeah, we will have to start somewhere, and then only the price will go down.
But achieving BS6, you have doubled the number of cars probably. And I think the lifestyle changes, as you said, is what we really need to, we have to start with ourselves.
Yes, cost will increase, no doubt about it. If we are going, see, this is what I also told, that we are anyway living in borrowed money from our future generation. I don't think we realize that how much we are consuming. We consume huge. And I'll tell you, people may not be aware, 1 kilogram of sugar and 1 kilogram of rice which we consume, you consume 3,000 liters of water for that. Can you really imagine the kind of resource intensive processes are? And with 7 billion population, where we are leading to, I don't know. Means unless and until we basically account for all these and start looking, living little bit more sustainability, this is not going to help us.
Good.
Rajnish, we're not going to go back to caves. I don't think that's going to happen. So something else will have to give way.
Yeah, the CCUS has to be there, and everything has to be there. I'm not only saying that green hydrogen has to come, CCUS has to come, renewables has to come, more plantation is necessary, afforestation and all kind of thing, along with our behavioral change. Everything has to come.
Correct.
Good. Wonderful.
Early
Wonderful.
days. Great presentation.
Great, sir.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much. So we would close now. A big thanks to Dr. Rajnish Kumar again. As we said, we will soon have a program in person, face to face.
Thank you very much, madam. And really nice interacting with all of you. And as I said, you can always drop me an email and we can discuss further offline.
Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.